What is up, everybody? I'm back here with a video on a Zoom platform today. We'll see how it goes. Looks kind of interesting. Should be good. Probably will work out. But let's talk a little bit about the divine ideas and their history. So this is a pretty interesting topic when you get into it. Occupies a ton of space in Aquinas, tons of current dialectics going on about it right now in the academic world. But before you jump into that, I think you really have to kind of understand the broader moves that are being made in the history of the tradition. So in Plato, it seems you don't really have discussion of ideas. And by ideas, we can refer to those, generally speaking, right now as exemplary causes or exemplary forms or paradigms. That's getting pretty technical already because those are going to be distinguished in thinkers. But basically, paradigms of the created world, are those in the mind of God? That's really the question that's going on. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about the history of this because I think you have to grasp that, as I said, before you get into the debate. So when in Plato, like I said, you don't really have a lot of discussion about this. And Plato's theory of the forms is a whole different topic. I'm not even going to get into that. It is extremely complicated and not at all what you think it is from your introductory classes or what you've heard. But, in Plato, you have the Timaeus, and in the Timaeus, you have the demiurge who models or who creates reality based upon a model or a paradigm. And contemporary scholarship seems to lean towards interpreting that as some sort of like craftsman or god like Zeus who creates the world. But the Neoplatonic view and Eric Pearl's view in his recent paper from about maybe 15, 20 years ago on this is that the forms or the paradigms of creation and the demiurge are identical there. So in Plato, I guess we can suffice it to say that you don't really get a technical discussion. This isn't really spelled out. And it seems like the demiurge could be identified with the thoughts of God or the paradigm for all reality. But anyway, if you want to know more about this, by the way, I'm just going to be reading from this script that I wrote, kind of. But I basically put this up on my blog. Link's going to be in the video description, so you can go check that out if you want to read along. But after Plato's, where things get really interesting. This is where you start to get a lot of dispute in the Old Academy. And Old Academy is like Speusippus, Xenocrates, these guys coming after Plato. And you have after Plato Xenocrates. And Xenocrates, we unfortunately don't have a lot of his work, but John Dillon, in this article that he wrote called Ideas as Thoughts of God, points out that it seems quite likely that Xenocrates took the first principle or God to be an intellect. And Dillon in the article quotes Iatus, I think that's how you say it, who has a testimony about this, because unfortunately we don't have a lot of Xenocrates' own stuff. But this guy says, Xenocrates holds as gods the monad and the dyad. The former is male, having the role of father, reigning in heaven, which he terms Zeus, and the odd and intellect, which for him is the primary god. And so Dillon, John Dillon, who wrote this article, is going to argue that this, along with some testimony from Theophrastus, who critiques Xenocrates, is sufficient to think that Xenocrates held God to be an intellect who had a paradigm of creation in his mind, speaking, very generally, roughly here, because we're talking about God. And so, this is pretty interesting. And Theophrastus, according to Dillon, critiqued Xenocrates for holding that God is an intellect which wishes the best for all things. So you can go check out this article if you want. It's called Ideas as Thoughts of God by John Dillon. But I think it goes to show that right after Plato, you have a divergence in opinion, because obviously with Plato, you have the demiurge and you have the good. And as Lloyd Gerson argues in his article called The Personhood of the One, which you can also find, it is very, very unlikely that the demiurge and the one or the good in Plato are going to be identified. The demiurge occupies a second role in the Platonic hierarchy. It's diminished with respect to the good or the one. And so, just to sum up, Xenocrates here seems to be departing from that view in Plato a little bit. Seems to be saying and thinking that intellect, or maybe demiurge possibly, because we can't really draw a lot of definitive conclusions based on the text that we have, but Xenocrates seems to be kind of doing away with this notion of the good as beyond ousia and identifying God as the intellect, which is contemplating ousia. So, I mean, the point I really want to make here is not that any of these guys are correct or that I have the definitive interpretation, but that it gets complicated. The problems are there, and I want you to wrestle with the problems. So let's get into this a little bit more. So after Xenocrates, we have Varro, and this is interesting because Varro is mentioned in City of God by Augustine quite a lot. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of scholarship around Varro, but we do know that he was the faithful disciple of a guy named Antiochus. And John Dillon also thinks that Antiochus and Varro tried to give a reading of the Timaeus as demythologized and argue that the forms, the paradigm of creation in the Timaeus, are the contents of the Stoic logos, or this eternal creative paradigm of reality. And the paradigm that the logos possesses is reflected in us. And so in creation, there is a bestowing upon the rational animals, namely humans, of this logos, in which we can then participate the divine. That's pretty common idea in antiquity. But here the point is mainly that you have another thinker who seems to think that God, or the first principle, possesses some sort of paradigm. And if we go to Augustine in the City of God, which again, you can find all this quoted in Dillon's article, Augustine points out that Varro, who we take to be a faithful disciple of Antiochus, indicates that the forms are understood as the goddess Athena who sprung from the head of Zeus. And this seems to indicate, according to Dillon's scholarship, that the forms are going to be the contents of the divine intellect. That's only indirect proof, but we can make a decent case for, I think, Varro and Antiochus holding to this. So let's continue on with this brief summary of the history of the ideas, and I'll skip over Philo. You can go to my blog post to see that. That gets complicated because Dillon seems to think that Philo really did hold that the intellect, that God possesses the forms or the divine ideas. And again, I'm using those terms a little bit loosely here because form is a very, very technical term. I want you to note that. But I'm just using it to refer to the divine exemplar paradigm of how God creates. So Dillon seems to think that Philo presents us with a God or first principle in which possesses the forms. But in a recent article by Gregory Dillon, he seems to think otherwise in his footnote to Philo. So I'm going to leave Philo be. I don't really know much about him. So you can go and check that out on your own. But when we go to Alcinous, we see something pretty crazy. So Alcinous actually was a Middle Platonist who wrote this book called The Handbook of Platonism. And in chapter 9, we see Alcinous clearly affirm the existence of forms as paradigms for creation, right? And the forms, Alcinous seems to think, are these paradigms that allow the creator to bring the creation about, similar to an idea that subsists in the mind of an architect who builds a house. So to quote him here, and again, this is on my blog, you can go read along, quote him here from chapter 9, form is considered in relation to God, his thinking, in relation to us, the primary object of thought, in relation to matter, measure, in relation to the sensible world, its paradigm, and in relation to itself, essence. For in general, everything that we can conceptualize must come to be in reference to something of which the model must pre-exist, just as if one thing were to be derived from another in the way that my image derives from me. So it's pretty clear that Alcinous takes God, or the first principle, to be thinking the forms, and the forms are located metaphorically or analogically speaking here in the mind of God. And that's the paradigm of creation. And I think this is really the clearest exposition of the divine ideas or forms as the divine ideas that you're going to get prior to somebody like Plotinus. So on my blog post, I talk a little bit about how Alcinous actually gives a couple arguments that are pretty cool. He tries to give an argument for the existence of forms via this divine thinking. And you can go check that out. I won't go into that, but it's a pretty neat argument I like. The basic premise is just that if God exists, then he would have to be an intellect, and therefore he would have thoughts, and those are the divine ideas or forms. Therefore, we have an argument once we establish God exists to the forms. But I'm not going to get into that. That's a huge, huge controversy. Let's turn after that to Origen as our kind of last little case study here. So with Origen, you really start to see a serious shift in how the forms are going to be conceptualized. And it seems, based upon Dillon's article that I'm kind of working with, along with Gerson's article I mentioned, and there's another one by Norris Clarke called, I think, The Problem of the Divine Ideas in the Christian Tradition, something like that. But based upon these three articles, it seems that Origen is making two distinct moves, one classic and one very new. So in his book on First Principles 2.3.6, Origen rejects the claim that the ideas are external to the divine intellect. So this is the kind of common trope that you see and hear about Platonism, where these ideas are taught to be or thought to be subsisting reified universals. And Origen clearly rejects this in this portion of the text. But Origen is a clear proponent of divine exemplarism, or again, this, similar to Alcinous, this paradigm that God possesses, which he models the world after. Now, where things start, that's a classic move. Origen's just following the tradition, it seems, there. But what's a very, very distinct move here, and this is going to be the advent of Neoplatonism, because Plotinus seems to make a similar move as well, but Origen is going to seem to identify the divine wisdom with the divine logos, and this is operating from his Christian tradition, but make this crucial distinction where the wisdom and the logos of God is diminished relative to the first principle. Okay, so let's take a look here. And this is going to be actually in his John commentary, 1.19.114 through 116. And it seems there that God the Father is entrusting God the Son with the creative task. And it looks like Origen is making the Son less than the Father, ontologically speaking, not temporally speaking. That's going to have, it doesn't seem to me that he's making the same move that Arius is doing in saying that there was a time at which the Son did not exist. But what it seems is that there's a distinction between the Father and the Son insofar as the Father entrusts the Son with the divine wisdom or logos, and the creation is through the Son. And again, later in, let's see here, in that same text, commentary on John 2.23.151 and 1.10.119, it's going to look like Origen claims that the first principle, or God the Father, is beyond the ideas as their source. And when you put these ideas together, right, it's pretty easy to conclude, and Origen is not, he's not going to be explicit with this, but it's pretty easy to conclude from this that he does not think the divine ideas are in the ultimate first principle, God the Father. He thinks that they're taking place at the level of the Son, which is where he gets into tension with this Trinitarian stuff going on. And I think that this is it's pretty clear to me that this is a distinct move in the history of philosophy, because up until now, it seems like we don't have any thinkers who identify the divine ideas taking place at a level lower than God. It seems like Origen's the first to do this. And Plotinus obviously does this as well, because the one is beyond the ideas due to its radical simplicity. So you have the one for Plotinus, which is beyond, giving rise to the divine ideas. So it possesses the divine ideas virtually, but not eminently. And it gives rise to the ideas which take place at a level secondary to the one, which is called nous or intellect. And it looks to me that Origen is doing something very similar based upon these lines in the John commentary, where he, again, to summarize, identifies the divine wisdom and Sophia and Logos in the Bible, and then reads the scripture as the Father bestowing the divine Logos onto the Son, who then creates. I mean, that to me sounds very, very similar to Aeneid 5.1 through 5. So in any case, I mean, what you can see here is that this brief account of these few thinkers raises a lot of crucial questions, problems. I mean, this is just a can of worms. And if you go to my blog, I have a few of my own reflections. So I'll just read out a couple of the questions that I formulated. Mainly, you know, why exactly do we not see this thought that the ideas had to be at a level below God? Why don't we see that until Plotinus and Origen? That's an interesting question to think about. Why is it that with Plotinus and Origen, this is the only time where you see that the first principle is not thinking or not possessing thoughts? What exactly was it in the history of philosophy, or what exactly was it about this time period that motivated Plotinus and Origen to think that the first principle had to be beyond thinking? Because Plotinus famously criticizes Aristotle's first principle for this, and says that the first principle can't be thinking because you have a distinction, and the first principle has to be simple. Why was it at this point in history that this happened? Why didn't it happen before? I'm not sure. So another thing to ask is, why is it that the divine intellect can't be the first for Plotinus? Why can't we have something that's a little bit complex as the first? Why does the first have to be pure radical simplicity? Why can't it possess the forms in a way that Aquinas, for instance, thinks that it does? This is really a complicated dialectic when you start to get into this question. So because that's going to have to do with what the forms are, what the divine ideas are, how they are playing a role in your metaphysics, everything. So yeah, this is just, it gets really complicated really quick. But I mean, those are just two questions. I have a few more listed, but I want you to really kind of take a step back and think, right? Think about a few questions. Namely, what is it that is motivating these thinkers to say this? What impact will it have on your religious practice or philosophy? And who do you think has the best arguments? Who do you think has the best arguments? Alcinous seems to just take it as primary, or take it as kind of a first principle that God has to be an intellect. I'm not sure he gives any arguments. I couldn't really find any, but it seems like you might be able to make that move. Why do you think Plotinus would criticize that, though? You know, that's an open question. And then for the Christians in the audience, what exactly is it about Origen's point of view, which seems to be, again, that the Father is at a level ontologically higher than the Son and bestows upon the Son the creative power? What is it about that was so problematic to the early church, specifically at the Council of Nicaea? Do you think that's identical with Arianism? I am not sure. I don't know. So in any case, this, you know, raises a lot of questions, but I'll leave you with that to think about. Again, the articles I referenced were John Dillon's Ideas as Thoughts of God, Lloyd Gerson's Personhood of the One, and Norris Clarke's Problem of the Divine Idea. So you can go take a look at those, comment below what you think, and yeah, have fun.